The emergency signal cut through space like a knife through silence. Deep inside the massive Galactic Command Station, Admiral Vexthera felt her stomach drop as the message came through her communication system. Her 4 purple arms shook as she listened to the desperate voice crackling through the static. The voice belonged to a Zephyrian colonist, one of the few survivors from what used to be a thriving world. His words were broken, filled with terror that made even the experienced admiral's blood run cold. He spoke of something called the Devourers, creatures that had appeared from the dark depths of space without warning. These weren't just raiders or pirates looking for resources. These things consumed entire planets, eating everything until nothing remained but empty space. Vexthera had seen war before. She had commanded fleets in border disputes and territorial conflicts. But this was different. The colonists described ships that looked alive, pulsing with organic tissue mixed with metal and technology. When the Zephyrian defense forces had tried to fight back, their weapons had barely scratched the enemy vessels. Worse yet, any damage they managed to inflict healed itself within minutes. The admiral quickly pulled up the tactical reports from the 3 council fleets that had already tried to stop these invaders. The results were horrifying. The first fleet had been completely destroyed, their ships torn apart by weapons that seemed to grow stronger with each battle. The second fleet had managed to retreat, but half their vessels were lost. The third fleet had scattered after witnessing something so terrible that the surviving captains refused to speak about what they had seen. As Vexthera studied the data, she noticed a disturbing pattern. The Devourers weren't just randomly attacking. They were systematically moving through the outer colonies, consuming each world completely before moving to the next. At their current rate of advance, they would reach the core worlds within months. Billions of innocent lives hung in the balance. The emergency council meeting was unlike anything Vexthera had ever witnessed. Representatives from dozens of different species filled the great chamber, their voices rising in panic and desperation. The Zephyrians were known throughout the galaxy as peaceful traders who had never hurt anyone. They shared their advanced agricultural techniques freely and had helped feed entire star systems during difficult times. The thought of these gentle beings being devoured by monsters was unbearable. Species after species offered their military forces, but everyone knew it wouldn't be enough. The Devourers had already proven that conventional warfare was useless against them. Their ships seemed to learn and adapt to every weapon used against them. Traditional battle tactics failed because the enemy didn't follow any known rules of engagement. The chamber fell silent when old Counselor Mordak slowly rose to his feet. The ancient being was respected throughout the galaxy for his wisdom, but his next words shocked everyone present. His voice was so quiet that the translation devices had to strain to pick up his suggestion. He spoke of Earth, that dangerous world on the edge of civilized space. Most species considered it a death trap, a planet so hostile that it was amazing anything could survive there. The humans who lived there were known throughout the galaxy, though not in a good way. They came from a world of ice ages, volcanic eruptions, massive storms, and deadly creatures. While other species had evolved on peaceful garden worlds, humans had clawed their way to the top of a food chain filled with monsters. The galactic community had always kept humans at arm's length. They were too violent, too unpredictable, too dangerous. Their methods of warfare were considered barbaric by civilized standards. They fought with a ferocity that made other species uncomfortable. Most worlds wouldn't even allow human visitors, considering them too risky. But now, facing an enemy that conventional forces couldn't stop, Mordak suggested the unthinkable. Perhaps the galaxy's greatest outcasts were exactly what was needed. The humans had survived everything their deadly world had thrown at them. They had turned survival into an art form and warfare into a science. They didn't retreat when facing superior odds. They didn't surrender when things looked hopeless. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone understood what he was suggesting, but no one wanted to be the first to agree. Calling for help from humans meant admitting that the civilized galaxy couldn't protect itself. It meant turning to the very beings they had spent centuries avoiding. As the debate continued, reports kept coming in. Another colony had gone silent. The Devourers were getting closer to populated systems with each passing hour. Time was running out, and desperate times called for desperate measures. Admiral Jake Morrison stood quietly on the command deck of the massive warship Retribution, holding the official message from the Galactic Council in his weathered hands. The bridge around him buzzed with quiet activity as his crew worked at their stations. These weren't fresh recruits or peacekeepers. Every person on his bridge had seen real combat, had fought in the brutal wars that seemed to follow humanity wherever they went. Captain Lisa Hayes, his trusted second-in-command, looked up from her tactical display with a mix of disbelief and dark amusement on her face. She had been with Jake through 3 major conflicts, and her expression showed exactly what she thought about this situation. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. For decades, the galactic community had treated humans like dangerous outcasts, refusing them membership in their prestigious council and keeping them isolated on the edges of civilized space. Now those same aliens were practically begging for human help. Lisa's voice carried the bitter edge that came from years of being looked down upon by species who considered themselves more evolved and peaceful. The galactic community had made it clear that humans were too violent, too unpredictable, too primitive for their sophisticated society. Human diplomats had been turned away from countless worlds, human traders had been banned from major trade routes, and human colonists had been forced to settle in the most dangerous and unwanted sectors of space. Jake studied the tactical data streaming across his personal display, analyzing the enemy ship designs and battle reports. The information painted a grim picture. These Devourers weren't just another hostile species looking for territory or resources. They were something far worse. The reports described massive biomechanical ships that could repair themselves, weapons that seemed to learn from each battle, and a complete disregard for any form of communication or negotiation. What struck Jake most deeply was the scale of the destruction. Entire colonies had been consumed, leaving nothing behind but empty space. These weren't military targets or strategic installations. These were homes, schools, hospitals, and farms. The Devourers were killing families, children, and innocent civilians who had never hurt anyone. For humans, the moral choice was crystal clear. It didn't matter that the galaxy had rejected them. It didn't matter that these same species had called them barbarians and savages. When innocent people were dying, humans responded. It was built into their very nature, this instinct to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Earth's history was filled with stories of people rushing toward danger to help strangers, even when it meant risking their own lives. Within just a few hours of receiving the message, the entire human military machine began moving with frightening efficiency. Earth's orbital shipyards lit up with activity as vessels that had been in maintenance were rapidly prepared for combat. These weren't the sleek, elegant ships that other species preferred. Human warships were built like tanks, designed to take massive amounts of damage and keep fighting. They had thick armor plating, multiple backup systems, and weapons that could fire even when half the ship was destroyed. Across Earth's surface, news networks carried live broadcasts of the mobilization. Families gathered around their screens, watching as their loved ones prepared to leave for a war in distant space. There were tearful goodbyes at military bases, children hugging their parents one last time, and spouses promising to wait for their return. The human population understood what was at stake, even if the beneficiaries had never shown them kindness. Jake addressed his fleet commanders through secure communication channels, his voice carrying the weight of command and the burden of responsibility. He acknowledged what everyone already knew. Humans had been called monsters by the galactic community for their willingness to fight, their refusal to back down from conflicts, and their ability to find creative solutions to impossible problems. Today, they would discover what real monsters looked like when faced with human determination. Commander Mike Collins, the grizzled leader of the Marine assault teams, couldn't hide his grin as he listened to the briefing. His Marines were specialists in the kind of close-quarters combat that most species found terrifying. They were trained to fight in the most dangerous environments, to board enemy ships, and to engage in the brutal hand-to-hand combat that civilized warfare had supposedly left behind. Collins and his teams had been waiting for a mission that would truly test their abilities. The preparations continued around the clock, with supply ships loading ammunition, medical supplies, and equipment for extended combat operations. Human engineers worked tirelessly to upgrade weapons systems and improve ship defenses. Intelligence officers analyzed every piece of data about the enemy, looking for weaknesses that could be exploited. As the massive fleet prepared to depart Earth's solar system, there was a sense of grim determination among the crews. They were heading toward an enemy that had already defeated multiple galactic fleets, armed with nothing but their human stubbornness and refusal to give up when lives were on the line. The moment the human fleet emerged from hyperspace, every person on every bridge fell silent. What they saw before them was beyond anything their worst nightmares could have imagined. The Zephyrian system, which had once been home to billions of peaceful traders and their families, was now a graveyard of consumed worlds. Massive creatures floated through space where planets used to orbit their sun. These weren't ships in any traditional sense. They were living nightmares, kilometers long, with surfaces that pulsed and writhed like diseased flesh. The bioships were literally feeding on the broken remains of worlds, extending grotesque appendages to consume chunks of rock, metal, and anything else that had once been part of a thriving civilization. Lieutenant Tom Brady, stationed at the sensor array on the flagship, had seen combat before. He had witnessed the aftermath of brutal ground battles and devastating space conflicts. But nothing had prepared him for this. His hands shook as he watched the sensor readings, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The enemy vessels weren't just using organic technology. They were alive, breathing, growing things that defied everything humans understood about spacecraft design. Around the massive feeding creatures, smaller bioships moved in coordinated patterns that reminded everyone of white blood cells protecting a diseased organism. These escort vessels were roughly the size of human destroyers, but they moved with an unsettling fluid grace that no mechanical ship could match. Their hulls seemed to shift and change as they moved, adapting their shape for different purposes. The moment the human fleet appeared, every devourer vessel in the system turned toward them with predatory focus. It was as if some central intelligence had instantly identified the new arrivals as a threat and mobilized every available unit to respond. The smaller bioships began accelerating toward the human formation, their weapons systems charging with an eerie green glow that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. These weapons didn't look manufactured. They appeared to have grown from the ship's hulls like tumors or organic protrusions. As they powered up, the green energy writhed and twisted like living lightning, giving everyone who saw it an instinctive feeling of revulsion and fear. Admiral Jake Morrison's voice cut through the communication channels with calm authority, addressing every ship in the human fleet. His words were simple but carried the weight of human military tradition. This wasn't going to be a clean, civilized engagement like the ones taught in galactic military academies. This was going to be brutal, messy, and deadly. The goal wasn't to look good or follow proper procedures. The goal was to stop these creatures from consuming any more innocent lives. Captain Amy Johnson, commanding the heavy cruiser Sledgehammer, received her orders and immediately began accelerating toward the enemy formation. Her ship was built like a fortress, with armor plating thick enough to withstand direct hits from the most powerful conventional weapons. As the Devourer bioships swarmed toward her position, any other species would have tried to maintain distance and engage with long-range weapons. Instead, Amy did something that violated every principle of civilized warfare. She pointed her ship directly at the largest cluster of enemy vessels and pushed her engines to maximum power. The Sledgehammer lived up to its name, smashing through the enemy formation like a battering ram. The impact sent shockwaves through both fleets as human engineering met alien biology in the most violent way possible. The collision tore massive holes in several bioships, but instead of retreating to assess damage, Amy immediately launched her boarding teams. Human Marines in powered combat armor used cutting torches and explosives to carve their way into the enemy vessels while the ships were still locked together. This kind of close-quarters combat was something most galactic species had abandoned centuries ago, considering it too barbaric for modern warfare. The Marines found themselves fighting in corridors that looked more like the inside of some massive creature than a spacecraft. The walls pulsed with alien life, strange fluids dripped from organic conduits, and the air itself seemed thick with an atmosphere designed for creatures nothing like humans. But the Marines pressed forward, using flamethrowers and high-explosive charges to destroy whatever vital systems they could find. What the Devourers discovered in that first engagement was something they had never encountered before in their campaign of consumption. Every other species they had faced fought defensively, trying to preserve their forces and minimize casualties. When outgunned, they retreated. When facing superior numbers, they looked for escape routes. When their weapons proved ineffective, they attempted to negotiate or surrender. Humans did none of these things. When faced with superior numbers, they attacked more aggressively. When their weapons proved insufficient, they got creative and found new ways to cause damage. When retreat would have been the logical choice, they pressed forward with a determination that bordered on madness. The battle quickly became a chaotic melee as more human ships followed Amy's example, ramming into enemy formations and launching boarding parties. The Devourers found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to have no sense of self-preservation, no understanding of when they were beaten, and no limit to the violence they were willing to inflict. For the first time in their campaign of galactic consumption, the Devourers encountered prey that fought back with the fury of predators protecting their pack. Colonel Rebecca Davis slid down the rope from her transport helicopter, landing softly in the smoking ruins of what had once been a beautiful Zephyrian city. The buildings around her were partially dissolved, their elegant crystalline structures reduced to melting slag by the Devourers' feeding process. Her combat boots crunched on debris that had once been homes, schools, and markets where families had lived peaceful lives just days before. Her squad of 12 Marines landed beside her, each one a veteran of Earth's harshest conflicts. They moved through the devastated streets with the fluid coordination that came from years of urban warfare training. While most galactic species had evolved on peaceful garden worlds where the biggest threat might be a mild storm, humans had learned to fight in environments that would kill other beings within minutes. The Devourers hadn't just consumed the planet from orbit. They had landed massive ground forces to finish the job. These weren't the sleek bioships that fought in space. These were land-based horrors that looked like giant insects crossed with military vehicles. Each creature was roughly the size of a human main battle tank, with thick chitinous armor that could deflect most conventional weapons. Their multiple legs ended in razor-sharp claws that could tear through concrete and steel with ease. Sergeant Matt Wilson, positioned at the front of the formation, suddenly raised his fist in the universal military signal for contact. His plasma rifle was already charging as he spotted movement in the rubble ahead. The Devourer ground unit that emerged from the debris was unlike anything in any military manual. Its 6 legs moved with insect-like precision while weapon pods along its back began glowing with the same sickly green energy they had seen on the ships. Matt's training kicked in immediately. He had grown up hunting dangerous animals in the wilderness of Alaska, where a moment's hesitation could mean death. His plasma rifle sent a concentrated beam of superheated energy directly into what looked like the creature's sensory cluster. The alien chitin was tough, designed by millions of years of evolution to protect against natural predators, but human weapons were designed by intelligence and desperation. The ground battle that followed showcased something the galaxy had never understood about humans. While other species had evolved as prey animals or peaceful gatherers, humans were persistence hunters. On Earth, early humans had tracked massive woolly mammoths across frozen landscapes for days, never giving up until their prey collapsed from exhaustion. This same relentless determination now served them against an enemy that had never faced anything like it. High above the surface, Captain Kevin White led his fighter squadron through aerial maneuvers that would have made pilots from other species pass out from stress. Human fighter craft were built to handle the brutal G-forces that their pilots could endure, far exceeding what most galactic species could survive. Kevin pushed his engines beyond recommended limits, diving through clouds of enemy biofighters with aggression that seemed reckless but was actually calculated precision. His squadron followed him in formation, their ships dancing through three-dimensional space in patterns that took advantage of human reflexes and spatial awareness. The enemy biofighters were fast and could regenerate damage, but they couldn't adapt quickly enough to counter human unpredictability. Where galactic pilots flew with programmed precision, human pilots flew with intuition and creativity. Kevin's voice crackled over the communication system as he reported to ground control. His fighter squadron was discovering something important about their enemies. The Devourer biofighters could heal themselves and learn from previous encounters, but this process took time. Human pilots could change their tactics faster than the aliens could adapt, staying one step ahead of an enemy that had consumed dozens of other species. The battle on the ground continued to rage as Rebecca's Marines advanced through the city ruins. They used tactics that other species considered suicidally aggressive, moving from building to building under heavy fire. When conventional weapons proved insufficient against the heavily armored ground units, they switched to explosives, flamethrowers, and close-range combat techniques that most civilized armies had abandoned centuries ago. What the Devourers discovered during this ground engagement was that humans didn't fight like other species. Most galactic militaries fought to minimize casualties and preserve their forces for future battles. They calculated odds, assessed risks, and retreated when the situation became untenable. Humans fought with controlled fury, pressing forward even when facing superior numbers or better equipment. Admiral Jake Morrison watched the tactical displays from his flagship, observing something that filled him with grim pride. Human units were advancing through territory where Galactic Council forces had been retreating for months. Red markers on his display showed human forces pushing deeper into enemy-held areas, reclaiming ground that had been written off as lost. The key to human success wasn't superior technology or overwhelming numbers. It was their fundamental approach to warfare. While other species fought with calculated precision, trying to minimize risk and preserve their forces, humans fought with the fury of a species that had clawed its way to the top of a hostile planet's food chain. They didn't just fight to survive. They fought to protect others, to eliminate threats completely, and to ensure that their enemies would never be able to harm innocents again. As reports continued to stream in from various battlefronts, it became clear that the tide of war was shifting. The Devourers, who had consumed entire civilizations without significant resistance, were now facing an enemy that matched their aggression with calculated violence and refused to yield ground even when facing impossible odds. The human fleet approached the Devourer home cluster like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. What they found at the coordinates defied every law of physics and biology that civilized space understood. Dozens of consumed worlds had been somehow fused together into a single massive structure that pulsed with alien life. Planets that had once supported billions of inhabitants were now nothing more than organic building blocks in this nightmare construction. The cluster stretched across several million kilometers, its surface crawling with biomechanical growths that served as both weapons and sensory organs. Ships the size of small moons drifted around the structure like protective satellites, their hulls breathing with the rhythm of some massive heartbeat. This wasn't just a military base or a staging area. This was the living brain of the species that had terrorized the galaxy. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his flagship, looking out at the monstrosity through reinforced viewing ports. His fleet had fought its way across 3 star systems to reach this place, leaving a trail of destroyed Devourer forces behind them. His ships showed the scars of countless battles. Hull plates were twisted and blackened, weapon systems had been jury-rigged after taking direct hits, and entire sections of some vessels had been sealed off due to damage. But they were still here. Still fighting. Still pushing forward when any sane military force would have retreated to regroup and plan a different approach. Jake's voice carried across the fleet communication channels, reaching every human warrior who had volunteered for this final assault. His words were simple but filled with the kind of righteous anger that had driven humanity through its darkest hours. The Devourers had made a critical error in their calculations. They had studied dozens of species, consumed entire civilizations, and learned to counter every form of resistance they encountered. But they had never faced a species that considered the protection of innocents to be more important than their own survival. They had never encountered beings who would travel across the galaxy to fight monsters simply because it was the right thing to do. Captain Jennifer Brown commanded the heavy assault ship Phoenix, a vessel designed specifically for breakthrough operations. Her ship had taken more damage than any other in the fleet, with entire sections exposed to space and emergency power routing around destroyed systems. But her engines still worked, her weapons could still fire, and her crew was ready to follow her into the depths of hell itself. As Jennifer led the first wave toward the cluster's defensive perimeter, her ship became a living torch. Enemy bioweapons tore through her armor plating, setting internal systems ablaze and filling her corridors with smoke and sparks. Any other species would have ordered an immediate retreat to preserve what remained of their forces. Instead, Jennifer pushed her engines beyond safety limits and carved a burning path directly through the heart of the enemy defenses. Behind her burning ship, massive transport vessels filled with human marines prepared for what would go down in military history as the most dangerous boarding operation ever attempted. These weren't the sleek, sterile troop carriers that other species used. These were armored fortresses designed to deliver their cargo of human soldiers directly into the mouth of destruction. Commander Mike Collins addressed his assault teams over the internal communication system, his voice carrying the kind of dark humor that had sustained human warriors through countless impossible situations. His Marines were equipped with flamethrowers, plasma cutters, high explosive charges, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. They would need all of it and more to survive what was coming. The boarding operation began with controlled explosions that tore massive holes in the cluster's outer shell. Human assault teams poured through the breaches, finding themselves in corridors that looked like the inside of some diseased organism. The walls pulsed with alien circulation systems, strange fluids dripped from organic conduits overhead, and the air itself was thick with spores that would have been toxic to most species. But humans had evolved on a planet where the atmosphere itself had tried to kill them for millions of years. Their immune systems and respiratory filters handled the alien environment while they pressed deeper into the structure. They moved through spaces that would have driven other species insane, fighting past biomechanical defenses that seemed to grow from the walls themselves. The deeper they went, the stranger things became. They found chambers filled with the stored memories of consumed civilizations, organic computers that processed the thoughts of billions of devoured beings, and breeding pools where new devourer units were gestated from the biological remains of their victims. Lieutenant Rachel Green led her demolition team through the final corridors toward what their sensors indicated was the central command structure. This was the brain of the entire devourer network, the organic supercomputer that had coordinated the consumption of hundreds of worlds across the galaxy. It was a massive pulsing mass of neural tissue and biomechanical interfaces, suspended in a chamber the size of a cathedral. As Rachel armed the final explosive charges, she spoke words that would be remembered long after the war was over. Her voice carried the pain and anger of everyone who had lost friends, family, and entire worlds to these creatures. The explosion that followed wasn't just the destruction of a military target. It was humanity's final answer to a species that had chosen to prey upon the innocent. The blast tore through the hive mind like a neural stroke, severing connections that had controlled devourer forces across the galaxy. Within minutes, reports began coming in from every battlefield. Enemy forces that had been fighting with coordinated intelligence suddenly became confused and directionless. Bioships that had moved with purpose now drifted aimlessly through space. In the aftermath, as human rescue ships reached the surviving colonies, something remarkable happened. Alien civilians who had been taught to fear and avoid humans now watched in amazement as human medical teams worked tirelessly to save lives. The same hands that had wielded weapons with deadly precision now treated injuries with gentle care. The galaxy learned a lesson that would reshape interstellar politics for generations to come. Sometimes civilization needed its warriors, and sometimes the monsters that others feared were exactly what was needed to fight real monsters.